The station floated in the dark between three dead stars. It was called the Assembly, a place where the most powerful beings in the known galaxy came to talk, argue, and decide the fate of worlds. It was massive, so massive that entire warships docked inside it like small boats in a great harbor. Lights covered every surface. Strange sounds filled every corridor. The smell of 100 different worlds mixed in the recycled air. And on this day, every seat in the Grand Council chamber was filled. The chamber itself was built like an ancient theater, with rows of seats rising high on every side, curving inward so that everyone could see the center floor. The seats were filled with generals, queens, warlords, and ambassadors from 47 different species. Some were tall as trees. Some had 4 arms. Some had skin that shifted color when they felt strong emotion. They wore armor, silk, bone, and light. They carried titles older than human civilization. At the front of the chamber, behind a long curved table of black stone, sat the most important of them all. Princess Queen Valith of the Oran Empire sat in the center seat. She was tall, even by Oran standards. Her people were engineered for perfection: long limbs, sharp eyes, minds that could process a battle map in seconds. Her armor was silver and deep blue, trimmed with gold lines that marked every war she had personally led. She had been a commander since the age of 20. She was now, by human counting, nearly 400 years old. She had never lost a battle. She looked at the human seat and found it, as always, unimpressive. Earth had one representative, just one. A man who walked into the chamber without ceremony, without an escort, without so much as a flag carrier behind him. He wore a plain gray uniform, dark blue trim on the shoulders, a small patch on his chest with the symbol of the Earth Defense Force, a simple globe with a ring around it like a child's drawing of a planet. He carried nothing. No weapons display. No rank banner. No metal board pinned to his chest, though Oran officers of his supposed level usually wore them like walls of achievement. He was not tall, he was not broad. He had dark hair going gray at the sides, a plain face, and quiet eyes that moved slowly around the room as he walked to the human seat. He sat down. He placed his hands flat on the table, and he waited. His name was Ethan Voss. He held the rank of commander in the Earth Defense Force, and outside of a small number of people in that room, nobody knew anything about him. Valith looked at him, the way a person looks at something they are not sure belongs in the room. The session opened. The Covenant speaker, a tall, thin creature from the Pelhari species, with 6 fingers on each hand and a voice like distant bells, called the chamber to order. The reason for the emergency council was stated plainly. The Vreth swarm was moving. The hive mind that consumed entire systems, that left nothing behind but silence, was pushing deeper into Covenant space. 3 colony systems had already gone dark. A 4th was not responding to signals. The chamber stirred. Even the most powerful beings in the galaxy grew uneasy when the Vreth were discussed. The speaker called for each delegation to introduce itself formally and state its military standing. It was tradition. One by one, the great powers of the galaxy stood and spoke. The Tharosi Confederation sent Admiral Kren, a thick, scarred being with gray-green skin and 8 combat decorations. He stood, gave his name, named his fleet, 400 warships. The Dorathi Collective sent High Warlord Shenka, a being so large that even the Oran officers near her leaned slightly away. She named her fleet, 600 vessels, including 3 planetary siege ships. The Lorveth sent a council of 5 speakers who all talked at once in a layered voice that sounded like music. Their fleet, 380 ships. On and on it went, numbers, power, history, legacy. Then the speaker reached the human seat. Earth Defense Force, the speaker said, Commander Ethan Voss. Voss stood. He was not the shortest person in the room, but he looked it just then. Commander Ethan Voss, he said. His voice was calm, not loud but clear. Earth Defense Force, assigned as Earth's military representative to this council. He sat back down. There was a pause, a long one. Valith tilted her head. She looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has answered a question with the wrong century. "Is that all?" she asked. Her voice carried easily across the chamber. She was not trying to be unkind. She simply saw no reason to pretend. "That's all," Voss said. "No fleet count," Valith said. "My fleet count is classified at the Covenant command level," Voss said. Valith looked at the officers beside her. One of them made a small motion, a orin gesture that roughly meant he's joking. Another covered what was clearly a smile. "Commander," Valith said, letting the word sit a moment before continuing. "I have been attending these councils for over a century. I have seen every species in this covenant send its finest. I have sat across from beings who commanded armies that could crack moons." She paused. "And Earth has sent us a man in a gray coat with no augmentations, no fleet number, and the quiet energy of someone waiting for a transport." The chamber reacted. Not with loud laughter, these were heads of war, not schoolchildren, but with the sound that power makes when it finds something small amusing. Low murmurs. A few short sounds. The Durathi warlord made a clicking noise that her translator rendered as a chuckle. Valith did not smile. She simply waited, as if offering Voss a chance to defend himself. Voss looked at her. His expression did not change. His hands stayed flat on the table. He did not shift in his seat. He said nothing. That was perhaps the strangest part. Every being who had been insulted at this table in the past had reacted, some with anger, some with formal challenge, some with the cold political words of diplomatic offense. Silence was not something the chamber was used to. Voss simply waited for the room to finish. Valith gave the smallest shrug and looked away. She had already decided he was unimportant. The session moved on. Maps were brought up on the central display, glowing lines showing the Vreth advance. Strategies were proposed. Numbers were argued over. The chamber became loud and complicated. And through all of it, Ethan Voss sat quietly, watching the display, his eyes moving slowly and carefully across every line of data. At no point did he look bothered. At no point did he look lost. He looked to anyone who cared to notice, like a man who had already seen everything in that room before and had already begun to solve it. Nobody noticed. At the back of the chamber, the Covenant's central archive system processed routine identification checks on all attendees. When it reached Commander Ethan Voss, it ran the name, returned a file, and immediately flagged the access level. Restricted, Covenant command authorization required. The system logged the flag. The flag sat in a queue. Nobody was watching the queue. The chamber continued its arguments. The maps glowed. The great powers of the galaxy talked about strategy and survival. And Ethan Voss watched the Vreth movement pattern on the central display and quietly noticed something that nobody else in the room had seen yet. He picked up a small stylus from the table, turned over the paper agenda in front of him, and began to write. Admiral Kren did not sleep well on stations. He never had. His species, the Therosi, were creatures of open sky and hard ground. Enclosed spaces made their instincts restless. So when the first session of the council broke for the night cycle, Kren walked the outer corridors of the assembly station alone, listening to the hum of its great engines and thinking. He was thinking about the human. Kren had fought alongside humans twice in his long career, once at the border conflict near the Ashari Reach, and once during the supply route defense at Caldris. Both times, the human units had done things that Therosi battle doctrine said were not possible. Both times, Kren had watched and not fully understood what he was seeing. He had filed reports afterward that his superiors had read with polite confusion. He remembered asking a human lieutenant once, after a particularly strange flanking move that had saved both their units, how they had thought of it. The lieutenant had shrugged and said, "It seemed like the thing to do." Kren had not known what to do with that answer. Now he had seen Ethan Voss sit in that chamber, and absorb a public insult from one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy without so much as a change in his breathing. And something in Kren's instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive through 40 years of active combat, told him to be very careful about how he thought of this man. He found Valith's chief of staff, a tall Oran officer named Sareth, near the east observation deck. Sareth was reviewing tactical files on a small display pad, the faint light catching the gold lines of his rank armor. Kren stopped beside him. "Your queen embarrassed the human today," Kren said. "He was not a being who used many words." Sareth glanced at him. The human gave her little reason to do otherwise. "Did anyone look up his record?" Sareth paused, a small pause, but Kren noticed it. "He is a commander in the Earth Defense Force," Sareth said. "Earth has been a Covenant member for less than a century. Their military history in space is—" "Look up his personal record," Kren said. "Not Earth's, his." Sareth looked at Kren for a moment. Then he looked back at his display pad. His fingers moved across it with the automatic speed of a career officer. The Covenant's archive system came up. He entered the name. VOSSETHAN, Commander Earth Defense Force. The system returned the file, and then immediately placed a banner across the top of it. "Restricted, Covenant Command Authorization Required." Sareth stared at the banner. He had accessed thousands of military files in his career. He had clearance for nearly all of them. He had never personally seen that particular access restriction placed on a single officer's combat record. "I will," Sareth said quietly, "need to inform the Princess Queen." Kren nodded once and walked away. It took Sareth 4 hours to get the authorization. He had to go through 2 levels of Covenant command, and both times the officer on the other end of the channel paused for slightly too long before granting access. The file, when it finally opened, was long, much longer than any single officer's record had a right to be. He brought it to Valith in her private chamber just before the second cycle began. She read it standing up. She did not sit down once during the entire time she read it. The file began with the basics. Voss had enlisted in the Earth Defense Force at age 19, young, even by human standards. He had come from a place called the Pacific Northwest, which meant nothing to Valith but which apparently had forests. He had done well in training without being remarkable. He had been assigned to a border patrol unit and spent 2 years doing nothing interesting. Then the file changed. His first real action was a conflict that Earth called the Eshari border incident. A hostile force, not Vreth, but a territorial expansion by a species since absorbed into the Covenant, had pushed into a human-held region. Voss was a sergeant then. His unit's commanding officer was killed in the first day. Voss assumed command without orders to do so. He held the region for 11 days with 63 soldiers. The enemy force numbered over 4,000. He suffered 12 casualties. The enemy lost contact with over 900 of their own troops before withdrawing. The after-action report from the Covenant observers present described his tactics as structurally incoherent but devastatingly effective. Valith turned the page. It went on for a very long time. The siege of Caldris VII came next. Voss, now a captain, had been stationed on a moon base with 300 soldiers when the Vreth advanced scout fleet arrived ahead of expected projections. The Covenant's own battle models had given the base a survival window of 4 days before the position would be overrun. Evacuation was impossible. Reinforcements were 3 weeks away. Voss held for 40 days. Valith read the account 3 times. She was looking for the part where he had received reinforcements early, or where the Vreth force had been smaller than reported, or where some other factor had shifted the equation in his favor. She did not find it. His force held with what they had. The casualty rate for his soldiers was low enough to be almost insulting to the laws of probability. The casualty rate for the Vreth was significant enough that the advance fleet eventually redirected. The Kureth ambush followed, then the engagement at Meridian Point, then a conflict referred to only as the Pelhari Corridor Defense. Each one was the same shape, Voss, worse odds than any reasonable commander would accept. Outcome, victory. Method, something that battle analysts from 5 different species had reviewed and consistently failed to fully explain. Then she reached the entry labeled, the Silence AT Eben Gate. Most of the file was blacked out, classified beyond her authorization level, which meant classified beyond nearly anyone's authorization level. What remained was a single data block. Enemy forces, approximately 12,000 vessels. Human forces, 17. Engagement duration, 6 hours 14 minutes. Outcome, human victory. Enemy fleet destroyed or disabled at 94%. Human losses, 2 vessels. Method of engagement, classified. Notes from Covenant Command Oversight. We do not have a tactical model that produces this result. We have reviewed the sensor logs 11 times. We have no explanation. The logs have been sealed. Valith closed the file. She stood still for a long time. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Vreth were moving. And inside this station, in whatever quarters Earth had assigned to its representative, a man who had won 300 engagements without a single loss was sleeping, or not sleeping, in a gray uniform with no medals and no rank banners. He had sat in her council chamber today. She had laughed at him. She had laughed at him in front of every significant military power in the known galaxy. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she did it, not angry, not embarrassed, not performing patience for the room. He had simply looked at her with quiet, flat eyes, the way a person looks at weather. Something that is happening that is not personal and that will pass. Sarath, she said without turning around. Her chief of staff appeared in the doorway, Princess Queen. Tomorrow's session, she said. I want the human given a seat at the primary table. Sarath was quiet for a moment. He already has a seat at the primary strategy table, she said, not the outer ring, center. Another pause. Yes, Princess Queen. She kept looking at the stars. And Sarath, she said, do not tell him I read the file. Of course. She did not sleep that night either. In his quarters 3 levels below, Ethan Voss sat at a small desk under a single light. The paper agenda from the council session was in front of him, covered on both sides in small, careful writing. Numbers, vectors, timing estimates. A rough sketch of the Vreth advance pattern overlaid with the positions of every Covenant fleet in the region. He had been at it for hours. At some point he made a small mark on the upper corner of the page, circled it, and sat back. His expression was not satisfied. It was the expression of a person who has confirmed something they were wrong about. He looked at the mark for a long moment. Then he folded the paper carefully, placed it in the inner pocket of his gray jacket, turned off the light, and finally slept. The second session of the council had been running for 2 hours when the alarm started. Not the soft, measured warning tones that stations used for drills or minor system alerts. These were the deep, resonant alarms that shook the walls, the ones that station designers built into the metal itself, so that no living thing on board, regardless of species or hearing range, could fail to notice them. Every being in the Grand Council chamber looked up at the same moment. The central display, which had been showing a political map of Covenant space, flickered and switched automatically to tactical mode. Sensor feeds from the station's outer detection grid filled the screen in sharp red lines and cluster markers. Vreth bioships, a large formation. They had come out of faster-than-light travel less than 40,000 kilometers from the station's outer hull, At that range, in military terms, they were already inside the door. For one full second, the chamber was completely silent. Then it exploded. Chairs scraped back. Voices rose in 6 different languages, then 12, then more, as translation systems scrambled to keep up. Officers on the outer ring began pulling up personal communicators, shouting into them. Aides rushed through side doors. The Durathi warlord Shenka was already standing, both of her massive hands pressing flat on the table, her eyes fixed on the sensor display with an expression that mixed fury and calculation. "How did they get this close without long-range warning?" someone shouted. The advanced sensors were calibrated for their standard entry patterns. An aide called back. "They came in at a different vector." "Our fleet, where is the nearest fleet?" 3 days minimum." The chamber dropped several degrees colder at that number. Valith stood at the center table, her eyes moving quickly across the tactical display. Her mind was already running numbers. The station had defensive weapons, point defense systems, a small ring of cannon arrays, shields built for an installation rather than a warship. The visiting vessels docked at the station added firepower, but they were from 12 different species with 12 different command systems, and getting them to coordinate in the next few minutes was a problem that could not be solved quickly. She began to speak, beginning to organize the chain of command, pulling together who had authority over which ships, establishing a communication order when she noticed something. At the human seat, Ethan Voss was not moving toward the doors. He was not on a communicator. He was not arguing with anyone. He was standing at the tactical display. He had walked there quietly during the chaos. Nobody had noticed him move. He was standing close to the central projection, hands clasped behind his back, head slightly tilted. His eyes moved across the display with slow, careful attention, like someone reading a page they have read before and are checking for changes. "Commander Voss," Valith said, and there was an edge in her voice, not intentional but born from urgency. "This is not a situation for observation. Return to your delegation area until—" "They have a command node," Voss said. He said it simply, not loudly, not as a challenge. He said it the way a person says something they are certain about. The chamber did not go quiet immediately, but Valith went quiet, and her silence spread outward. "What?" said Shenka from across the table. "Every Vreth assault formation has a command node," Voss said, still looking at the display. "A bioship that carries the primary relay signal for the swarm. It sits near the back of the formation, slightly off-center. The swarm makes coordinated decisions from it. If you destroy it, the rest of the formation loses coherence. They don't stop, but they stop thinking together. Individual units become much easier to handle." "We know what a command node is," Valith said. "Isolating one in an active formation takes weeks of signal analysis." 40 minutes, Voss said. "What?" "I need 40 minutes, your communication officer, and access to the station's passive sensor array." He finally turned to look at her. His face was completely calm. "And I need everyone to stop talking at once because it makes it harder to think." The chamber went very still. Valith stared at him. She was 400 years old. She had commanded fleets, broken sieges, and stood in rooms with beings who could tear steel apart with their bare hands. She was not accustomed to being told to be quiet. She looked at Admiral Kren. Kren met her eyes and said nothing. He simply gave the smallest possible nod. Valith looked back at Voss. "You have your 40 minutes, she said. What happened next was difficult for most of the beings in that chamber to fully follow. Voss moved to the communication station at the side of the room, pulled up the passive sensor feed, and began working. He did not use the standard analysis software. He bypassed it, pulled the raw data directly, and started reading it on a secondary screen while simultaneously sketching something with his hand on a physical notepad. The communication officer, a young Pelhari who had been trained for exactly this kind of emergency, watched Voss work, and after about 3 minutes, stopped trying to help and simply did whatever Voss asked without question. The requests were strange. Frequency isolation on a very specific bandwidth, decay pattern mapping on the bioship signals, a cross-reference with the station's gravitational sensor readings, which was not a tool anyone had thought to use for this purpose. The Vreth formation moved closer. The station's automatic defenses opened up, cannon arrays and point defense systems firing in patterns, slowing the advance but not stopping it. 3 of the docked ships received launch clearance and moved out to engage, buying time. 20 minutes passed. 30. The pressure in the chamber was enormous. Officers paced. Warlords gripped table edges. Someone from the Lorvath delegation made a sound like a kettle coming to boil, which was their species' expression of extreme stress. The station's secondary shields are at 60%, an officer called out. Valith kept her eyes on Voss. At minute 38, Voss straightened up. He circled something on his notepad. Then he looked up at the tactical display and pointed, not at a ship in the center of the Vreth formation, not at the largest bioship, not at any of the targets that standard Covenant doctrine would have identified. He pointed at a small vessel near the rear left of the formation. It was one of the least visually impressive ships in the swarm. "That one," he said. "That is not a command-class bioship by any profile in our recognition database," Sereth said sharply. "Your database is based on Vreth formations from 6 years ago," Voss said. "They changed their node placement. They moved it to a smaller vessel to make it harder to identify. The signal decay pattern and the gravitational microvariance in the formation's movement both point to that ship as the relay center." He turned to the communication officer. "Get me a line to the 3 ships currently engaged." The line opened. Voss spoke for 90 seconds. He gave coordinates, timing, and a firing sequence that used the different weapon types of all 3 ships in a specific order. Not because any one shot would destroy the target, but because the combination would overwhelm the bioship's regenerative hull process faster than it could respond. He closed the line. 44 seconds later, the target ship came apart. The effect on the Vreth formation was immediate and visible. The tight, coordinated advance broke. Ships that had been moving in clean, sweeping patterns began to drift. Some turned in directions that made no tactical sense. The outer units began to overlap each other. The formation lost its shape the way a sentence loses meaning when you remove a key word from the middle. The station's defenses, suddenly working against a disorganized enemy instead of a coordinated one, cut through the remaining bioships in less than 20 minutes. When the last Vreth vessel went dark on the display, the chamber was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Valith stood at the center table and looked at the cleared tactical screen. Around her, beings who had commanded armies for longer than human civilization had existed were also looking at the screen, and then at the man in the gray coat, and then at the screen again. Voss set down his notepad. He picked up the paper agenda from earlier, the one covered in his handwriting, and folded it back into his jacket pocket. Then he walked back to the human seat and sat down. He placed his hands flat on the table. He waited. The station's repair crews worked through the night cycle. The sound of their tools was a low, constant hum beneath everything. A sound that reminded everyone on board that something real had happened, that it had not been a drill or a simulation, and that the walls of the station carried fresh damage from a real enemy. Most of the council delegates stayed in their quarters or gathered in small groups in the common areas, talking quietly about what had changed. 3 delegates from smaller Covenant members requested immediate transport home. 2 warlords sent encrypted communications to their home fleets with new orders. Everyone was recalibrating. The attack had not been expected for another week at the earliest, according to every projection model the Covenant possessed. Valith did not stay in her quarters. She sent Sareth to find Voss an hour after the session formally ended. She told Sareth only that she wished to speak with the human privately, and that he should bring him to the East Observation Lounge, a smaller room off the main corridor, with wide windows and no recording equipment. Sareth found Voss in the corridor outside the council chamber. He was standing at a small wall panel, studying the station's internal schematic, not the public version that any guest could access. He had somehow pulled up the engineering layout, which required a secondary access code that Sareth was fairly certain the human did not officially have. Sareth decided not to ask about it. Voss followed without comment. The East Observation Lounge was quiet. A low amber light filled the room. Through the wide windows, the debris field from the engagement was still slowly spreading, dark shapes against darker space, moving apart with the patience of things that had nowhere to be. Somewhere in that field was what remained of the Vreth command node. Valith was standing at the window when they arrived. She had removed her formal armor and wore a simpler uniform, still Orin, still precise, still carrying the unconscious authority of someone who had never not been in charge. But without the armor, she looked more like a person and less like a symbol. Sareth left and closed the door. Valith did not turn around immediately. She kept looking at the debris field. "Sit if you want," she said. "I'm fine standing," Voss said. She turned then. She looked at him for a moment in the amber light, just looked, in the way that someone looks when they are trying to see something clearly that they previously did not take the time to examine. "I owe you an apology," she said. The words came without hesitation, which was unusual for Valith. She was skilled at political language, at apologies that were shaped like apologies but contained no actual admission of fault. This was not one of those. It was a plain sentence, directly delivered. Voss received it the same way. "Thank you," he said. "I was dismissive," she said. "I was publicly dismissive in a room full of beings whose opinions shape the politics of this covenant. I did it because you looked unremarkable, and I decided that was the same as being unremarkable. It was careless thinking for someone in my position." "It's a common mistake," Voss said. There was no satisfaction in his voice, no sharpness. He said it the way someone says something that is simply true. Valith moved to a chair and sat. Voss, after a moment, sat across from her. "I read your file," she said. "I assumed you would." "Ebon Gate," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That one's still classified." "I noticed," she looked at him, 17 ships. 14 of them were not technically combat vessels," he said. "But yes." She shook her head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the way someone moves when they are trying to make a piece of information fit inside their understanding, and it is taking effort. "I have spent 400 years studying war. I have access to the greatest military archives in the Orin Empire, which go back 10,000 years. I cannot produce a tactical model that gives you that outcome." "Neither could I at the time," Voss said. "I worked it out as I went." Valith stared at him. "That bothers you more than the number," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes," she said, "it does, because our systems, our planning, our doctrine, our models, they work on the principle that an engagement has a correct answer. You study long enough, you find the answer before the battle starts. Doctrine is the library of correct answers." She leaned forward slightly. "You are telling me you walked into Ebon Gate without a correct answer?" "I walked in with a direction," Voss said. "The answer changed 4 times during the fight. I changed with it." Valith was quiet. The debris outside the window drifted. "How," she said, "how does your species do this? We have given everything to the science of war, 10,000 years of records, genetic lines built for command, children trained from the age of 5 to read a battle space. And you," she stopped. She looked at him directly. "You show up without a medal and beat outcomes that our models say are impossible." Voss thought about this for a moment. He was not performing thoughtfulness. He was actually thinking, in the way that someone thinks when they have considered a question many times but are choosing how to say the answer. "You're 10,000 years," he said. "That's the reason." Valith frowned slightly. "You have 10,000 years of what works," he said. "That means you also have 10,000 years of what you stopped trying. You know what a command node looks like based on what it looked like 6 years ago. Your models tell you what an enemy will do based on what enemies have done. Your doctrine tells you which positions are defensible and which ones aren't." He paused. "We don't have 10,000 years. We have 100. We haven't learned what's impossible yet, so we keep doing things that are." Valith sat with this. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole answer, ignorance." "Ignorance," Voss said. "Freshness, there's a difference. Ignorance is not knowing something and being hurt by it. Freshness is not having been told something can't be done and so never considering that it can't." He looked at the window. "Every doctrine you have was written by someone who won a battle with a new idea. But then that idea became the doctrine and everyone learned it and eventually the enemy learned it too. The idea stopped being new. Your greatest strength is your knowledge, but knowledge has edges. Ours hasn't grown edges yet." Valith looked at him for a long moment. "You will eventually," she said. "Accumulate enough history and you'll calcify the same way." "Probably," Voss said, "but we have a few centuries before that happens, and right now the Vreth are moving." The room shifted, not physically, but in the way that a conversation shifts when it returns to the thing that matters most. Valith leaned back. "The main fleet," she said. "The attack today was a scouting formation. The projections say the main Vreth fleet is still 8 to 12 days out." Voss reached into his jacket pocket and took out the folded paper, the agenda from the first council session, covered in his handwriting. He unfolded it and placed it on the table between them. Valith looked at it. The calculations were dense and small. The sketch in the center showed the Vreth movement arc and a circle drawn at the end of a shorter line than any of the Covenant's own projections. "They are not 8 days out," Voss said. His finger touched the circle. "Based on the entry vector of today's scouting formation and the signal decay in their communication pattern, the main fleet is currently here, which means they are 3 days away, possibly less." Valith looked at the paper, then she looked at him. "You calculated this during the first session," she said, "when the maps were up." "Yes." "Before the attack." "Yes." "And you said nothing." He met her eyes. "The room was busy deciding who had authority over what," he said. "I was waiting for the politics to finish." She held his gaze. Something moved across her face, not quite amusement, not quite frustration. Something in between, with respect underneath both of them. "It won't finish," she said. "Politics never finishes." "No," he agreed, "but sometimes it pauses, and a pause is enough." He picked up the paper and handed it to her. She took it. Outside the window, the debris turned slowly in the dark. Somewhere beyond it, 3 days away, perhaps less, something vast and hungry was moving toward them. Inside the lounge, the two of them stayed at the table for another hour, talking about what came next. The Vreth main fleet arrived in 2 days and 9 hours. Not 3 days, not 8. 2 days and 9 hours, closer even than Voss had calculated, which meant the scouting formation had been covering a fleet already deeper into its advance than anyone had known. The assembly station's long-range sensors caught the signal bloom of their FTL emergence at a distance of just over 200,000 kilometers, close enough to see on visual. Close enough that the station's hull sensors registered the gravitational disturbance of their arrival, like a faint tremor in the floor. It was the station's night cycle. Most of the delegates were asleep. Voss was not asleep. He was already in the council chamber when the alarms began, seated at the central table with the tactical display running in front of him, a cup of something warm near his left hand and his notepad open beside it. He had been there for 6 hours. The chamber filled fast. Officers, warlords, delegates. They came in varying states of dress and composure, some with armor half-fastened, some still pulling rank insignia into place. The display showed the Vreth fleet in full now. It was not a scouting formation. It was not an advance party. It was the kind of force that ended things, thousands of bioships arranged in deep, layered columns, moving with the slow, certain pace of something that had never needed to hurry. The numbers on the display kept updating, bigger each time. Valith arrived last among the senior commanders. She took one look at the display, then looked at Voss and sat down directly beside him, not at the far end of the table, not at the head of her own delegation. Beside him. "The Covenant fleet?" she asked. 51 hours out, Voss said without looking up from his notepad. Minimum. The weight of that number settled over the room. "What do we have docked?" Admiral Kryn asked, his voice flat and professional. An aide pulled the list. 14 warships from 8 species. The station's own defensive systems. Point defense arrays. Shield generators rated for moderate sustained fire, not for the kind of bombardment that fleet could deliver. Someone from the outer ring said what everyone was calculating. "We cannot hold against that force with what we have." "No," Voss said, "not by fighting them the normal way." He stood up. The room looked at him. There was a difference in the way they looked at him now compared to 2 days ago. It was not reverence. Most of the beings in this room were too proud and too experienced for that to happen quickly. But it was attention, real attention, the kind that a room gives to something it has learned to take seriously. "The Vreth move in biological formations," Voss said. He brought up the display with a few inputs, expanding it so the fleet was shown in full detail. "Their tactical behavior is a collective response to shared stimulus. Every unit reacts to the same signal from the command structure. This makes them incredibly coordinated." He paused. "It also makes them predictable once you understand the signal." "We do not have the time to locate another command node," Valith said. "We don't need to," he said. "We're not destroying the node, we're confusing it." He began to explain. The room listened. Some of the alien commanders had difficulty following the logic, not because it was too complex, but because it was too strange. It did not match any doctrine they knew. It moved sideways when their training expected it to move forward. 2 of them asked him to stop and repeat sections. He did each time without irritation. The plan worked like this. The 14 docked warships would not form a defensive line. They would scatter, spreading in seemingly random directions, moving in patterns that had no standard military logic. Some would go toward the Vreth fleet. Some would move away. Some would move sideways to the engagement entirely. The key word was seemingly. Each movement was in fact precisely calculated, but calculated to produce something specific. A signal pattern that the Vreth command node would read as chaos, an attempt to respond to all at once. A hive mind, Voss explained, processes coordinated threats efficiently. It evolved to do that to face armies that moved in formation, that presented a clear shape, that had predictable intent. It was extraordinarily good at this. What it was not built to handle was a stimulus field that made no sense. When every unit in a swarm received simultaneous conflicting signal responses, the command node had to arbitrate between them. Each arbitration took time. Fractional time in biological processing, but enough. During those fractions, the formation would hesitate. And hesitation in a fleet engagement was everything. He then went species by species through the 14 ships, assigning each one a specific movement role based not on their firepower, but on their capabilities, speed, hull profile, engine signature, weapon type. The Tharosi ships were fast and would create the outermost signal noise. The Durathi heavy vessel would act as a false command target, its massive hull drawing the swarm's attention while the smaller ships worked around it. The 3 human vessels, small, light, and built with electromagnetic suppression systems originally designed for a different purpose entirely, would operate closest to the Vreth fleet and handle the most dangerous work. When he finished, the chamber was quiet. Warlord Shenka, who had led 600 ships into battle, who had cracked fortified moons, who was regarded across 4 sectors as one of the finest military minds alive, looked at Voss for a long moment. Then she said, "This requires every ship to operate independently, without central direction, trusting that the other ships are doing their part." "Yes," Voss said. "There is no unified command signal, no formation authority. Each captain makes decisions in real time based on the enemy's response to what the others are doing." "Yes," Voss said. "That is not how war is fought," she said. "Not usually," he agreed. Shenka looked at him, then she looked at Valeth. Valeth had been watching Voss throughout the explanation. She had seen him work twice now, once at the sensor station during the scout attack, and now here in this room, reshaping how 14 ship captains from 8 different species were going to think about the next few hours of their lives. She had commanded long enough to know what real tactical ability looked like, as opposed to the performance of it. This was real. She stood. The room shifted when Valeth stood. She was 400 years old. Her empire had fought wars before humanity had reached its own moon. Every officer in the room knew her name and her record. When she stood formally in a war council, it meant something. "Princess Queen Valeth of the Oran Empire," she said, using her own full title, which was the formal way of saying that what came next was official and meant to be recorded. "Yields battlefield command authority to Commander Ethan Voss of the Earth Defense Force for the duration of this engagement." She sat down. The room was perfectly still. Then Admiral Kren stood. "Admiral Kren of the Tharosi Confederation yields command authority to Commander Voss." Shenka stood. "High Warlord Shenka of the Durathi Collective yields command authority to Commander Voss." One by one they stood, every senior officer in the room. Some quickly, some after a breath's hesitation, but every one of them. They did it because they had watched a man who had never lost tell them how to do the impossible, and something in each of them recognized, professionally and without sentiment, that the shape of this moment required it. When the last one sat back down, Voss looked around the room. "Tell your captains to trust their instincts," he said. "Not their doctrine, their instincts. And tell them no matter what it looks like out there, keep moving. Don't stop. Don't reform. If it looks wrong, keep moving anyway. The only thing that will actually get us killed is hesitation." He looked at Valeth. She nodded once. He picked up his notepad, "Then let's go." What followed was recorded in the Covenant's historical archive under the designation, "The Engagement at the Assembly Station." The official record was 47 pages long and included sensor logs, communication transcripts, and analysis reports from 9 separate military institutions across the Covenant. 5 of those institutions ultimately labeled the engagement's outcome as statistically improbable and requested further review. None of them ever produced a model that fully explained it. The Vreth fleet encountered something it had never encountered before, not firepower greater than its own, not numbers that overwhelmed it, but a pattern that it could not parse. 14 ships moving in ways that shared no common logic, producing a stimulus field that the swarm's command structure attempted to process and arbitrate and could not resolve cleanly. The formation fractured in the middle of its own advance. Units turned against the wrong targets. Columns overlapped and created interference. The hesitations were fractions of seconds, but they were constant, and they were everywhere, and they compounded. The station's defenses, working against a disorganized swarm, did what they could never have done against a coordinated one. When the Covenant fleet arrived, they found the debris field and a station that was damaged but standing. The Vreth fleet was broken, not retreating, broken. Scattered units that had lost cohesion were being handled by the combined force methodically and without difficulty. Commander Ethan Voss filed his after-action report that evening. It was 4 paragraphs long, which was shorter than any report produced by any other command-level officer at the station. The Covenant's chief administrator sent a formal request for a longer version. Voss replied that the longer version would be classified and forwarded through proper channels. It was. 3 weeks later, by Covenant decision, his personnel record was unsealed and distributed to every military academy in the galaxy. It was the first time in the Covenant's history that a single officer's personal combat record was distributed as a required reference document. The final entry in the record, added by the Covenant's archive staff after the Assembly Station engagement, read simply: Commander Earth Defense Force, total engagements 301, losses 0, notes, do not underestimate. Valith read the updated file in her office aboard her flagship, 2 days after returning home. She read it from the beginning, even the parts she had already read before, and when she reached the last line she stayed with it for a long time. Then she closed the file, stood, and walked to the window. She was already thinking about the next council session, about what came after the Vreth, about the kind of mind that was useful in the galaxy as it was now, unpredictable, adaptable, and entirely unwilling to accept the logic of defeat. She was thinking that Earth, young as it was, had not sent a rookie at all. It had sent exactly what it meant to send. And the galaxy was only beginning to understand what that meant.